night. It was 1 o'clock in the morning. He goes, Dad, don't be mad. I knew something was terribly wrong. I said, what's going on? He said, listen, I'm fine. And don't forget, you told me to do this. I'm at a party, and my designated driver had too much to drink. And me and my friends need you to come pick us up. I said, Jesus Christ, it's 1 o'clock in the morning, nigga. I am shit-faced. But I figured, fuck it, it's better me than some kid. I might as well roll the dice and go pick my nigga up. I said, all right, I'm coming to get you. Just give me the address and I'll be right there. And then he gave me the address and I was shocked. I said, son, you are not going to believe this, but I'm at the same party.
Good morning. It's Friday, Fight Song Friday, January the 30th, and this is The True Conservative. Welcome to all the butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers out there. I'm Ron, your host, and the only true conservative in the United States today. So today, after the Serenity Prayer and the patriotic song of the day, we will have Varney and Company, motivation, meditation, and the Cold War. All that and more when I get back. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I should not change, the courage to change the things I should, and the wisdom to know the difference. Amen. Thank you. And now, Varney and Company.
Final thoughts from E.J. Antoni and Jonathan Fahey. Your reaction.
President Trump just launched the Great American Recovery Initiative, dealing with opioid and other addictions. It's an incredible move, and I think one thing President Trump doesn't get enough credit for, drug overdose or drug deaths are down substantially, down to about 70,000. They average 102,000 a year under Biden. Another great step to even make that number lower.
That's a great point. EJ, your thoughts on the morning? We had a hotter than expected PPI. I'm not surprised. Hard assets have been rising for 6 months, at least.
Yeah, exactly, Maria. But again, I am so glad that we're going to have somebody like Kevin Warsh at the Fed. It was a great pick by the president because it's somebody who realizes that the economic growth that we're already seeing and we're going to continue to see for the rest of this year is not the cause of this inflation. And so the Fed does not have to smother the growth right now. It can actually help it and keep it going.
All right, we will leave it there. Great to have you gentlemen this morning. Thank you, Jonathan Fahey and EJ Antoni. Thanks so much. Have a great weekend. And thank you so much for being here. We'll see you next week. Varney and Company begins now. Stu, take it away.
Good morning, Maria. Good morning, everyone. We thought there was a deal to fund the Department of Homeland Security and prevent a government shutdown, but it stalled. The Senate debated last night, took no action. Speaker Johnson is now doubtful that a deal can be reached. At this point, with only hours to go to the deadline, we're staring another shutdown in the face. Are the Democrats prepared to close the government in order to gut the Department of Homeland Security? Same old, who gets the blame? It is now official. President Trump has selected Kevin Warsh to be the next chair of the Federal Reserve. He sees eye to eye with the president. He, too, wants interest rate cuts. Now, when that news broke, gold and silver plummeted. That's an understatement. This time Thursday, gold was priced around $5,600 an ounce. Now, it's just over $5,000, down significantly. Silver touched $120 an ounce. Now, it's under $100. And there's a continuing sell-off in stocks, too. An uptick in the producer price index is not helping. The Dow off 250, the Nasdaq is down 166. Apple posted big revenue gains and a blowout quarter for iPhone sales, but the stock has been swept into the wave of big tech selling. Pre-market is down just a fraction, a couple of cents, that's it. Bitcoin, that's down. 82.6 is the current quote. Little change for interest rates, though. We have the 10-year coming in at 4.26 and the 2-year around 3.56. Oil, that's moving up, $64 a barrel. Gas, therefore, has stopped falling. You're stalled at $2.87 on average for regular. All right, on the show today, anti-ICE protests go national today. Organizers demand no shopping, no school, no work. Tom Homan is trying to lower the temperature, but the Democrats are ratcheting up their rhetoric. The left wants DHS Kristi Noem fired. President Trump says she still has his confidence. Melania, the movie, released today. The critics dismiss it as a vanity production. The fashion world snubs her. But in the movie, she comes across as articulate, elegant, and beautiful. A first lady to admire and respect. Friday, January the 30th, 2026.
And that was Varney and Company. And nonprofit news now. Back in a minute. Thank you. Now a little motivation. Maybe I shouldn't. No, I'll do it.
Until you have had the taste of finishing. Until you follow through. Until something is done. Fighting through tears and trials and tests. And pushing through all of it. Until you get to that point. You will not respect yourself. Persistence, patience, perseverance. When something doesn't work, there's always another solution. You see, I will try 100 times to get up, and if I fail 100 times, if I fail and I give up, do you think that I'm ever going to get up? No. But if I fail, I try again and again and again. For as long as I try, there's always that chance of getting up. And it's not the end until you've given up. Whatever dream you have, you're going to have moments of feeling deceived and isolated and persecuted and condemned and powerless. Long journey, long dark night of the soul, but when you hold on to your dream, don't let anybody kill it in you. When it doesn't make sense to anybody, including you sometimes, just hold on. Every time you find yourself saying that you can't do something, putting yourself down, being negative about you and the possibilities for you, you've got to literally catch yourself. And you've got to affirm to yourself in the process, hey, no, I can make it. There's some way this can happen for me. You've got to remind yourself that you've got powers within you, talents within you that you haven't even reached for yet. That once you give yourself an opportunity to try and to experiment with your life, to stretch, you'll find out you can do more than you could ever begin to imagine.
It's only going to take one more for that thing to happen that you want to achieve. It's only going to take one more. You have more in you. You're probably one idea away from it. You're probably one step away from it. You're probably one action item away from it. You're literally one more away from whatever it is you're trying to do to get to the next level. Just one more. And I'm telling you, you're not where you want to be financially, and it's not going to take 20 shots. You are not where you want to be in your personal life. You are not the person you want to be, and it's not going to take you 20 shots. For some of you, it's one more shot. For some of you, it's two more shots, and you have not given yourself enough credit to say, I just need to get up a half hour earlier, and my whole life will change. I just need to get up 1 hour early. I just need to work 1 hour longer. You just need one more shot at your life, one more perspective at your life, one more way to look at your life, one more way to act and behave your life. You just need one more. Give it one more day. Give it one more chance. Give it one more opportunity. I dropped out of school. I'm not going back to college. Go back. You weren't the right version of you. Go back now. You need one more shot at it. You'll finish this time. Give me that adversity one more time. I saw it the wrong way last time. I just need one more adversity. I just need one more challenge. I just need one more opportunity to show you that I can be responsible. Just give me one more time with adversity so I can learn how to understand adversity. It's not about the hand you were dealt, but now giving it one more time, you're going to play your hand differently. Let me look at the same hand, but let me look at it a different way now. And the problem with some of you in this room, you will never be great because every time you go through pain, every time you go through a problem, every time you go through discouragement, you give up and you quit and you do not understand that at the end of pain is your millions. At the end of pain is your reward. At the end of pain is your productivity. At the end of pain is your promise. So do me a favor, stop crying about it and use your energy to get through it. I just need one more shot. The last 20 shots, I was a victim. I need one more shot. This time I need to act like a victor. Recycle your pain. You can decide the shape, the form. You can decide the product that comes from your pain.
And that was a little bit of motivation. Back in a minute. Thank you. Now a little meditation. And that was a little bit of meditation. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, the Cold War.
It is late February 1991. It begins in darkness and silence. Not the silence of peace, but the cold, digital silence of a dead network. In a reinforced bunker deep beneath Moscow, in the final months of the Soviet Union, the air is thick with stale tobacco smoke and a new, unfamiliar dread. General Mikhail Moiseev, the granite-faced chief of the Soviet General Staff, stares at a map that no longer makes sense. For weeks, he and his analysts had watched the American-led coalition's air campaign against their client state, Iraq. They had watched with professional, if arrogant, detachment. Soviet doctrine, the doctrine drilled into the Iraqi Republican Guard, was built to absorb such a blow. Air power, they believed, was a scalpel, not a scythe. It could harass, it could delay, but it could not annihilate a prepared, dug-in army. The real war, the ground war, would be a bloody meat grinder. The Americans, with their unproven, all-volunteer force, would be trapped in a quagmire. The Soviet T-72 tanks, the BMP infantry fighting vehicles, and the layered web of Soviet air defense systems would exact a price in blood that the West was not willing to pay. That was the theory. That was the consensus. On February 24th, 1991, that theory was vaporized. The first reports were dismissed as battlefield fog, then as panic, then as outright lies. The ground war, code-named Desert Sabre, was supposed to last for weeks. It was over in 100 hours. This is the mystery. Not a single impossible event, but 100 hours of continuous, cascading, impossible events. The teletypes in Moiseyev's bunker, chattering with reports from GRU military intelligence agents in the region, began to paint a picture not of a war, but of a possession. Entire divisions of the Iraqi army, once the fourth largest in the world, were not just being defeated, they were being erased. A signal intercept from a panicked Iraqi corps commander to Baghdad, captured by a Soviet signals intelligence post in the Black Sea, becomes a legend inside the GRU. The commander is screaming. He is reporting that his T-72 tank columns are on fire, not under attack, not engaging the enemy, simply on fire. He reports that the sky is buzzing. He says his men are fleeing. He begs for orders. He receives none. His transmission is cut short by a sound that is not a bomb, but a high-pitched electronic shriek, and then static. The Soviet General Staff is a body of pragmatists. They are masters of logistics, of numbers, of scientific warfare. And the numbers they were receiving were nonsensical. They did not compute. The Americans, according to Soviet intelligence, had launched their ground assault with a left-hook strategy, a massive flanking maneuver deep into the desert. This was a classic Soviet-style deep battle operation. The Iraqis should have seen it coming. Their radar, their patrols, their own Soviet-supplied reconnaissance units. They reported nothing. The American 7 Corps and 18 Airborne Corps, hundreds of thousands of men and thousands of armored vehicles, had moved hundreds of kilometers through open desert and simply appeared on the Iraqis' flank, like a phantom army emerging from a fog. How? How did they move so fast? How did they coordinate in the featureless, empty desert at night in a sandstorm? Soviet doctrine, for all its might, was a ponderous top-down system. It required maps, timetables, and rigid phase lines. The Americans were operating with a speed and flexibility that seemed to defy the very laws of military science. The reports from the air were even more terrifying. The impenetrable Iraqi air defense system, a dense network of Soviet SA-6 Gainful and SA-8 Gecko missile batteries tied to French Roland systems, a system the Soviet advisors had helped design, had been blinded, not just suppressed, but systematically hunted and dismembered in the opening nights of the air war. Iraqi pilots, flying advanced MiG-29 aircraft, were reporting ghost signals on their radar. They would see an American F-15 aircraft dive to engage, and their radar would simply vanish. Poof. Their screens would fill with static, and moments later, a missile they never saw coming would tear their aircraft apart. This was not war, it was electronic witchcraft. This is not just a military analysis. For the men in that Moscow bunker, it is an existential crisis. If you want to understand the new dimension of warfare that the Soviets were witnessing, and support the research that goes into these deep dives, consider subscribing to Cold War Impact. We are dedicated to chronicling these pivotal, world-changing moments. The true horror, the central mystery that chilled the blood of the Soviet General Staff, was not the defeat of an ally. It was the manner of that defeat. It was the realization that the entire Soviet military-industrial complex, a machine that had consumed nearly a quarter of the nation's GDP for 5 decades, had built an army designed to fight the last war. The Americans, it seemed, were fighting the next one. The hardware that was now burning in the Kuwaiti desert was the very same hardware defending the borders of the Warsaw Pact. The T-72 tank was the backbone of the Red Army. The BMP infantry fighting vehicle was its iron chariot. The doctrine of massed armor and layered air defense was not just a strategy, it was a state religion. And the Americans had just proven it to be a false faith. The analysts in Moscow scrambled. They searched for an explanation. Was it a secret new weapon? A new type of death ray or energy beam? The reports from fleeing Iraqi soldiers were filled with superstitious terror. They spoke of angels of death that swooped from the night. They talked of invisible tanks that killed them from miles away, long before the Iraqi crews could even see a target. They whispered about the steel rain, cluster munitions that fell from a clear sky and hunted their armor, seeking out the heat of their engines. But the most potent, most chilling symbol of this new, impossible warfare was yet to come. As the rout began, tens of thousands of retreating Iraqi soldiers and vehicles fled north from Kuwait City along a 6-lane road, Highway 80. They were in a full-blown, disorganized panic, a mix of stolen civilian cars, buses, and the elite of the Republican Guard's armor. They were trapped. They were exposed. And they were about to become a laboratory. For 10 hours, under a dark sky, American air power was unleashed on this column. Not with the brute force of carpet bombing, but with a terrifying industrial precision. This was not a battle. It was a harvest. When the sun rose on February 27th, the first satellite images began to filter back to Moscow. The analysts in the GRU headquarters could not believe what they were seeing. The images were not of a highway. They were of a graveyard. 2,000 vehicles, jammed bumper to bumper, incinerated, tanks with their turrets blown clean off, trucks melted into the asphalt. It was given a name by the media, the Highway of Death. To the men in Moscow, it was something far more terrifying. It was a message. It was a demonstration the mystery was no longer, can the Americans fight? The mystery was, what is this system that allows them to see everything, hit everything, and kill at will without even being touched? The Cold War, they suddenly realized, was not a stalemate. It was a checkmate they had never seen coming. And the hunt for how the Americans had built this unstoppable machine, this new god of war, had just become the most desperate investigation in Soviet history. The Highway of Death was not just a military catastrophe, it was an intellectual void. It was a problem for which the Soviet General Staff had no equation. In the weeks following the 100-hour war, the Kremlin's vast intelligence and military scientific apparatus began a frantic, desperate investigation. It was an autopsy not just of the Iraqi army, but potentially of their own. The first instinct was denial. It was blame. In closed-door sessions of the Stavka, the General Staff, the initial reports were savaged. The marshals, men who had built their careers on the hard arithmetic of tank columns and artillery saturation, pointed fingers at their client. The Iraqis were undisciplined. They were poorly trained. They were tactically inept. They had failed to employ Soviet-style deep battle doctrine correctly. A flood of orders went out. The GRU and KGB residenturas across the Middle East and Europe were tasked with a single top-priority directive: acquire any data related to the American Desert Sabre operation. They were to debrief every surviving Iraqi commander they could find, bribe any coalition official, and steal any scrap of technical data. At the same in Moscow, Soviet military advisors who had been attached to Iraqi units, men who had fled with the remnants of the army, were brought to secure Dacha compounds outside the city. They were not treated as guests. They were interrogated. These debriefings were exercises in futility and terror. The Soviet officers, many of them veterans of Afghanistan, were shaken. They described a war that did not follow the rules. They spoke of the American attack helicopters, the Apaches. A Soviet colonel, a tank expert, reported with a shaking voice that his Iraqi T-72 tank battalion, dug into a defensive berm, was plucked apart one by one. He described it as a shooting gallery. The Americans, he insisted, were firing from ranges of 4, perhaps 5 kilometers. This was impossible. The effective range of the T-72's main gun was 2,000 meters, maybe 3,000, with the AT-11 Sphere missile. But the Americans were not firing tank rounds. They were firing missiles that seemed to guide themselves, missiles that struck the T-72 tank's weakest top armor. The Iraqi crews, he said, never even saw the enemy. They would be staring into their thermal sights at an empty patch of desert, and 1 second later, their turret would be in the air. This was the first Phantom, the invisible helicopter that killed from beyond the horizon. The pilots had even more terrifying stories. The few Iraqi aces who had survived encounters with the USAF F-15 Eagle aircraft were almost incoherent. They spoke of a wall of electronic noise. They would take off, their MiG-29 aircraft's powerful radar scanning the sky. They would see nothing. Their ground-controlled intercept, GCI radar, the eyes of the entire air defense system, would also see nothing. Then, their cockpit warning systems would light up. A missile lock tone would scream in their ears. But from where? There were no bogies on the radar, no visual contacts. The sky was empty. One Iraqi pilot, trained in the Soviet Union, described the experience. It was like fighting a ghost, he told his GRU debriefer. I was flying my MiG-29, the best you gave us. I felt invincible. Then my screen it went white. Just snow. My RWR, radar warning receiver, was screaming that I was being painted by an eagle. I looked up, I looked left, I looked right. Nothing. And then I saw the smoke trail. Not at me, but from me. My wingman had just exploded. He never said a word. I dove. I ran. I did not fight. I just ran. This story, and others like it, began to build a legend, a bogeyman. Inside the technical bureaus, the scientists and engineers pored over the Highway of Death satellite photos. They analyzed fragments of American ordnance recovered by Spetsnaz teams who had covertly infiltrated the battlefield after the ceasefire. Their first conclusion was that the Americans had achieved total, perfect information dominance. This was a terrifying concept. Soviet doctrine was hierarchical. Orders flowed from the top down. American doctrine, it now seemed, was a network. Every soldier, every tank, every pilot, every satellite was a node in a single vast, interconnected brain. The Soviet analysts began to develop theories. Wrong theories. Theory 1. The super stealth bomber. The GRU was already aware of the American F-117 Nighthawk stealth fighter. They had seen grainy photos, but the scale of the destruction to Iraq's command and control bunkers suggested something more. They hypothesized the existence of a new invisible strategic bomber, a craft that could loiter over Baghdad itself, immune to radar, dropping laser-guided bombs with impunity. They were hunting for a new plane, a Project Aurora or something similar, convinced that a single silver bullet aircraft was the key. They were looking for the thing, not the system. Theory 2. The satanic electronic weapon. The reports of white radar screens and ghost signals led the KGB's Line X technical intelligence branch to a horrifying conclusion. The Americans had deployed a new form of electronic warfare that was not just jamming, but was actively invasive. They theorized that the EA-6B Prowler and EF-111 Raven aircraft were not just blinding Soviet-made radar, but were hacking it in real time. They believed the Americans could insert false targets, erase real ones, and even feed false commands to the missile batteries. This bordered on science fiction, but it was the only logical explanation for how a system so dense, so layered, could be rendered utterly deaf and blind. Theory 3. The space-based death ray. This was the most paranoid and the most secret of the theories. In the frantic search for an explanation for the plucked tanks, some high-level analysts in the strategic rocket forces began to wonder if the Strategic Defense Initiative, Star Wars, had been a lie. Not that it was a defensive shield, but that it was a cover for an offensive space-based weapons platform. Were the Americans using particle beams or high-powered lasers from orbit? Were the angels of death not helicopters at all, but beams of energy from the sky? This theory was quickly dismissed by the pragmatists, but the very fact it was discussed in classified memoranda shows the level of sheer, unadulterated panic. The investigation was going nowhere. It was producing myths, not answers. The marshals in Moscow were looking for a simple answer. They were looking for a schematic they could copy, a technology they could steal, a countermeasure they could design. They wanted to build a better radar, a faster missile, a thicker tank. But the evidence of the highway of death pointed to a conclusion that was far more terrible. The problem wasn't the quality of the Soviet hardware. The problem was the philosophy behind it. The Americans had built a system that made their hardware irrelevant. The F-15 aircraft was a 30-year-old design. The B-52 bomber was a 50-year-old design. But in 1991, plugged into this new network of impossible technologies, they were performing magic tricks. And the most impossible of these technologies, the one that truly enabled the entire ground war, was not a weapon at all. The Soviets had no name for it. They had no counter for it. They barely even knew it existed. It was a faint, impossibly precise signal, beamed from a constellation of satellites, a signal that told every American tank, every soldier, and every bomb its exact location on Earth, down to the meter. The Soviets were masters of the map and compass. The Americans, it turned out, had invented a new god, the god of where. And this new god was telling them exactly where the T-72 tanks were, even in the dark, even in a sandstorm. The investigation was a failure because the investigators were asking the wrong questions. They were looking for a ghost, a single phantom, when they should have been looking at the entire, invisible architecture of this new American way of war. While the marshals in Moscow hunted phantoms in satellite photos, the answer was not hidden in a single, secret airframe or a new type of particle beam. The answer was hidden in plain sight, in a series of logical, methodical, and revolutionary ideas that had been gestating in American think tanks and skunk works for over 2 decades. The American military that entered the Gulf War in 1991 was not the same military that had left Vietnam in 1973. The humiliation of that defeat, the OPEC oil embargo, and the looming numerical superiority of the Warsaw Pact had forced a brutal reckoning. The United States knew it could never again fight a war of attrition. It could never match the Soviet Union tank for tank or man for man. So it decided to change the rules. It decided to win a war of information. The American solution was not a single weapon. It was an ecosystem of technologies designed to do 3 things: see everything, blind the enemy, and share that information at the speed of light. The shift in perspective begins not in a desert, but in the quiet, sterile laboratories of the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, or DARPA. In the 1970s, as Soviet engineers were bolting thicker armor onto their T-72 tanks, American engineers were solving a far more complex problem: synchronization. How do you make an entire army move as one? The answer was the Global Positioning System, or GPS. It was a project that sounded like science fiction. The plan was to launch a constellation of 24 satellites into medium Earth orbit, a web of atomic clocks in the sky. Their sole purpose: to broadcast a continuous, impossibly precise time signal. To the American soldier, this was a miracle. For the first time in history, a tank commander, a paratrooper, or a ship's captain could look at a small digital receiver, a Dega or PLGR box, and know their exact location on the planet at any time, in any weather, down to the width of a small room. The Soviets, masters of the map and the compass, had perfected warfare in 2 dimensions. The Americans had just mastered the 4th dimension: time. This single, quiet technology was the linchpin of the left hook. While Soviet analysts assumed the Americans must have used maps, phase lines, and massive logistical preparations, the truth was far more elegant. The tanks of the 7 Corps did not navigate the empty desert. They were pulled toward their objectives by this invisible signal from space. They could move at full combat speed, at night, through a blinding sandstorm, and know precisely where they were, where their wingman was, and where the enemy, who was completely, utterly lost, was. It was this system that allowed an entire airborne corps to leapfrog a Republican Guard division. It was this system that allowed artillery batteries to shoot and scoot with pinpoint accuracy, never firing on a friendly. It was the god of where, and it made the 100-hour ground war possible. But knowing where you are is only half the battle. The Americans needed to know where the enemy was. While the Soviets theorized about a new, invisible bomber, they were only partially right. The F-117 Nighthawk, which the GRU had code, named Mogul Sheik, Gravedigger, was not a bomber in the traditional sense. It was a surgical tool. It was the silver bullet designed to shoot the enemy's brain. Born at the legendary Lockheed Skunk Works in Burbank, California, the F-117 was less an airplane and more a collection of flat radar-absorbing panels that happened to fly. Its design was a triumph of physics and computer modeling over aerodynamics. It was unstable, difficult to pilot, and could only fly at subsonic speeds. But it could do one thing no other aircraft on Earth could do. It could become a ghost. On the opening night of Desert Storm, 36 F-117 aircraft took off. Their targets were not tank columns or airfields. Their targets were the nodes of the Iraqi air defense system, the command and control bunkers, the central radar hubs, the communications switches. While the Soviet advisors in Baghdad cowered in their shelters, the F-117 aircraft pilots, flying with impunity over the most heavily defended city on Earth, were methodically dismembering the network. They dropped 2,000-pound laser-guided bombs directly into the ventilation shafts of Saddam's headquarters. They vaporized the sector operations centers that connected the hundreds of Soviet-made SA-6 and SA-8 missile batteries. When the Iraqi radar operators, staring at their empty screens, were suddenly told their central command was a crater, the entire impenetrable network collapsed. The F-117 had not fought the air defense system. It had murdered it in its sleep. It kicked down the door so the rest of the Air Force, the F-15 seconds, F-16 seconds, and B-52 seconds could come in and finish the job. This explained the blinded pilots. This explained the silent radar screens. But it did not explain the highway of death. It did not explain the plucked tanks. That required the final, and perhaps most revolutionary, piece of the puzzle. It was an ungainly-looking aircraft, a modified Boeing 707 airliner with a massive 30-foot-long canoe slung under its belly. It had no guns, no missiles, no bombs. It was the E-8 Joint Stars, and it was the single most feared weapon in the American arsenal, even though it had never fired a shot. Joint Stars stood for Joint Surveillance Target Attack Radar System. That bland name concealed a terrifying capability. The canoe underneath the plane housed a phased array radar, so powerful it could scan a 20,000 square mile patch of ground, an area the size of a small country, and track every single moving vehicle within it. This was the all-seeing eye. While the F-117 aircraft were killing the brain and the GPS satellites were guiding the body, the Joint STARS aircraft were watching. Flying in safe orbits, hundreds of miles from the front, the operators inside the E-8 could watch, in real time, as an Iraqi T-72 tank battalion started its engines. They could see the convoy of trucks trying to resupply a frontline unit. They could see the panicked retreat forming on Highway 80. And the Joint STARS aircraft was not just an eye, it was the brain. It was a network. The operators on the J-STARS would see the Iraqi tanks moving. They would instantly data link those coordinates, not with a slow, crackling voice call, but with a digital burst to other platforms. The first was the E-3 AWACS, the Airborne Warning and Control System. The AWACS, in turn, would look at the F-15E Strike Eagle aircraft under its control, see which one had the best angle and the right munitions, and digitally hand off the target. The F-15E pilot would not have to hunt. He would not have to search. He would simply see a target appear on his cockpit map, pre-verified and pre-approved. The second platform, and the one that so terrified the Iraqi tankers, was the AH-64 Apache attack helicopter. The Apache was a flying tank killer, but its true power was its TADS, a target acquisition and designation site. It was a globe on its nose that combined thermal imaging with a laser designator. Here is how the magic happened, the impossibility that the Soviet colonel could not understand. A J-STARS, 50 miles away, sees a T-72 tank. It data links the target to an Apache helicopter lurking 5 miles from the tank, hidden behind a sand dune. The Apache's crew never even sees the tank with their own eyes. They simply slaves their TADS to the J-STARS coordinates. A green box appears on their thermal screen. The gunner presses a button, firing a Hellfire missile. This missile was the Angel of Death. It was fire and forget. The missile would fly high, then dive down, striking the T-70, 2 tanks' thin top armor. The Apache would be gone before the Iraqi crew's secondary explosions had even finished. This was the system of systems. This was the American ingenuity. It was the GPS satellite, talking to the J-STARS, talking to the AWACS, talking to the Apache, talking to the Hellfire missile. The Highway of Death was not a battle. It was the logical, systematic, and inevitable result of this network. The J-STARS saw the column forming. The AWACS deconflicted the airspace. And then, for 10 hours, a 10 Warthog aircraft, F-15E Strike Eagle aircraft, and F divided by A-18 Hornet aircraft were fed a steady, unending stream of targets, as if on a conveyor belt. It was a harvest, enabled by a complete, total, and terrifying information dominance. The Soviets had been building a better spear. The Americans had built a central nervous system. The shock did not arrive in Moscow as a single, explosive revelation. It did not come from a high-level defector with a briefcase full of blueprints. It came as a slow-motion intellectual collapse, as the GRU and Soviet scientific institutes finally, painstakingly, assembled the mosaic of their own obsolescence. The confrontation was not a battle, it was a report. In the summer of 1991, months after the war, and only months before the Soviet Union itself would cease to exist, a final, classified assessment was delivered to the desk of Marshal Dmitry Yazov, the Minister of Defense. It was not a hot take from battlefield officers. It was a consolidated analysis from the NII-4, the Fourth Scientific Research Institute of the Ministry of Defense, the body responsible for analyzing foreign military technology. This report was the reveal. It was the moment the ghost in the machine was finally given a name. Or, more accurately, a list of names. The report's first and most devastating conclusion was that the Soviet Union had fundamentally misunderstood the American Strategic Defense Initiative, or Star Wars. The analysts now stated, with chilling certainty, that the true, operational Star Wars was not a fantasy of space-based lasers meant to stop nuclear missiles. The true Star Wars was GPS. This was the shock moment. It was a profound academic and deeply terrifying realization. The Americans had already built their space-based military system, and it was not defensive. It was an offensive support network. The entire Soviet military, from its ICBMs to its tank divisions, relied on a terrestrial-based understanding of the world. They were map and compass warriors. The Americans had become map and satellite warriors. The NII-4 report detailed, for the first time, how the global positioning system was not just a navigation aid. It was a force multiplier of near-mythical power. It was the impossible technology that allowed the 7 Corps to perform the left hook in a sandstorm. It was the impossible technology that allowed American artillery to fire with pinpoint accuracy, land a single salvo, and move before the Soviet-made counter-battery radar could even get a lock. It was the impossible technology that allowed a B-52 bomber, a 50-year-old airframe, to drop dumb bombs with the precision of a smart one, simply by knowing exactly where it was in space when it released them. The marshals were horrified. They had spent a decade and billions of rubles developing countermeasures to a hypothetical American space shield, while the Americans had actually deployed a system that made their entire conventional ground army obsolete. The second reveal in the report was the identification of the all-seeing eye. The analysts had cross-referenced sorties, signal intercepts, and satellite data. They isolated the E8 joint stars. They now understood what it was. It was not just a radar plane, it was a battle management platform. This concept was alien to Soviet doctrine. In the Red Army, the man in the field fought, and the general in the bunker commanded, based on reports that were hours or even days old. The Americans, the report concluded, had fused the general and the soldier. The J-Stars was a general in the sky, who was not just watching the battlefield, but orchestrating it in real time. This, the report stated, was the secret to the highway of death. It was not a chaotic, target-rich environment, as the Western media portrayed it. It was a methodical, systematic deconstruction. The J-Stars operators were the conductors, and the F-15E, A-10, and Apache aircraft were the orchestra. The J-Stars identified the high-value targets, the T-72 tanks, the air defense batteries, and assigned them to the shooters. It was this system of systems that finally broke the Soviet analysts' minds. It was not the F-117. It was not the Apache helicopter. It was not the GPS. It was the network that bound them all together, the data link. A Soviet MiG-29 pilot was a lone wolf, guided by a fallible human controller on the ground. An American F-15 pilot was a node. He was plugged into the AWACS, which was plugged into the J-Stars, which was plugged into the GPS. The American pilot had the omniscience of a god. The Soviet pilot was flying blind. The shock was total. The investigation had ended with a horrifying truth. The Red Army was a colossus, a giant of steel and muscle, but it was stupid. It was a decentralized, uncoordinated brute. The American military, by contrast, was a smaller, more nimble organism, but it had a single, brilliant, and lightning-fast central nervous system. The futile response had already begun, even before the report was finalized. Countermeasure 1, the stealth hunt. The Soviet Air Defense Command, PVO, was thrown into a panic by the F-117. They had spent decades building the most dense, layered, and sophisticated air defense network in the world, designed to detect high-flying, fast-moving bombers like the B-52 and B-1. The F-117 proved that speed and altitude did not matter. Only signature mattered. Soviet engineers, in a desperate crash program, began pulling their old technical manuals. They realized that their older, long-wave radars, the P-12 Spoonrest and P-18 Spoonrest-D, were theoretically capable of seeing the F-117. These low-frequency radars were not precise enough to guide a missile, but they could detect a blob where the high-frequency targeting radars saw nothing. The new doctrine was born of desperation. AP-18 would spot the blob and then network that data to an SA-10 Grumble missile battery, which would fire a missile into the box, hoping for a kill. It was a failure. It was a clumsy, slow, and unreliable Rube Goldberg machine. The Americans, by contrast, were already well into the development of the next generation, the F-22 Raptor. The Soviets were trying to counter a ghost with a net, while the Americans were already designing a poltergeist. Countermeasure 2, the Apache killer. The sheer terror inspired by the AH-64 Apache and its Hellfire missile sent the tank design bureaus into a frenzy. The T-72, the backbone of the army, was a death trap. Its main weakness, a carousel autoloader that stored ammunition in the crew compartment, meant that any penetrating hit, especially from a top-down attack, would instantly detonate the entire tank, vaporizing the crew. The fix was a series of add-on solutions. Engineers scrambled to design Contact 5, a new generation of explosive reactive armor, ERA. These were bricks of explosives bolted to the tank, designed to detonate outward when hit, disrupting the incoming missile's plasma jet. It was a patch. It was a band-aid on a severed artery. It made the tank heavier, slower, and did nothing to solve the fundamental problem. The Apache could still see the T-72 tank from 5 miles away, while the T-72 tank could see nothing. The Soviet response was to add more armor. The American solution had been to transcend armor. Countermeasure 3, the GPS jammer. The most futile response was to the god of where. The GRU understood that GPS was the linchpin. They tasked their electronic warfare divisions with developing powerful truck-mounted jammers. The Smelchak, Daredevil, and R330 systems were rushed into production, designed to broadcast a wall of white noise on the GPS frequencies, blinding the American receivers. It was a complete, systemic failure. They had missed the point. The Americans, anticipating this, had already designed the system to be redundant. The GPS signal had 2 codes, the civilian C divided by A code and the encrypted jam-resistant military PY code. Furthermore, American tanks and aircraft were not just using GPS. They were using an inertial navigation system, INS, a series of gyroscopes and accelerometers that knew where the vehicle was based on its own movement. The GPS signal was simply a corrector. It would true up the INS every few seconds. Even if the Soviets managed to jam the signal for a few minutes, a massive, power-draining if the American tank would still know where it was, with far more accuracy than the Soviet T-72 tank crew that was hopelessly lost, staring at a paper map in the middle of a desert. The investigation was over. The truth was on the table. Every countermeasure was too little, too late. The Soviet Union had built an army to fight World War II again. The Americans had built an army to fight the 21st century. The highway of death was not a battle. It was a revelation. It was the public execution of a failed philosophy. The numbers, in the end, are the most brutal. They are the final, cold verdict, delivered by the unfeeling arithmetic of war. The killer statistic of Operation Desert Storm is not one number, but a cascade of them, each one more impossible than the last. The first is 100. The ground war, the great meat grinder that the Soviets had assured their Iraqi clients would last for weeks, perhaps months, was over in 100 hours. An army of over 500,000 men, with thousands of tanks, was routed, encircled, or destroyed in just over 4 days. The next is the air-to-air kill ratio. American F-15 Eagle aircraft, many of them flying airframes built in the 1970s, flew with total impunity. They shot down 38 Iraqi fixed-wing aircraft in aerial combat. In that same campaign, 0 F-15 aircraft were lost to enemy fighters. The pilots of the elite Soviet-trained Iraqi Air Corps, flying the very best MiG-29 and MiG-25 aircraft that Moscow could provide, were not just defeated. They were prey. Then there is the armor. The final tally is still debated, but the consensus is staggering. Nearly 4,000 Iraqi tanks, the vast majority of them Soviet T-72, T-62, and T-55 models, were confirmed destroyed or captured. In exchange, the American 7 Corps lost a total of 36 M1A1 Abrams tanks. And even that number conceals the true, horrifying disparity. Of those 36 American tanks lost, not a single one was destroyed by an Iraqi tank's main gun. The handful of Abrams tanks that were knocked out were victims of friendly fire, or were intentionally scuttled after being damaged by mines. The Soviet T-72 tank, the symbol of Red Army power, the brute force weapon that was supposed to smash its way to the Rhine in 72 hours, had proven itself to be a $4 million coffin. Its armor was incapable of stopping an American sabot round. Its gun was incapable of penetrating an M1's Chobham armor. Its fire control, lacking the thermal sights and laser rangefinders of the Abrams, was blind. This was the verdict. The Soviet war machine was a paper tiger. This military failure was not a failure of courage or even of numbers. It was a failure of philosophy. It was the final fatal symptom of a deeper systemic disease, the core sickness of the Soviet economy. The Soviet system was built on imitation. The American system was built on innovation. Throughout the Cold War, the GRU and KGB Line X had been spectacularly successful at stealing American hardware. When the Americans built the B-29 Superfortress, the Soviets stole one and, bolt for bolt, reverse-engineered it to create the Tupolev Tu-4. When the Americans built the first atomic bomb, Soviet spies stole the designs. The Soviet military-industrial complex was a gigantic, powerful, and effective photocopier. But in 1991, they learned a terrifying lesson. You cannot steal a network. You cannot reverse-engineer a philosophy. The system of systems that had annihilated the Iraqi army was not built on steel, but on silicon. Its true power was not in the bombs, but in the microprocessors that guided them. The magic of the J-Stars was not in its radar antenna, but in the advanced software and high-speed processors that filtered the data. The impossible accuracy of the M1 Abrams tank was not in its cannon, but in its digital ballistic computer. And this was the one war the Soviet Union had already, irretrievably, lost. While the American military was tapping into the explosive, chaotic, and creative energy of Silicon Valley, the Soviet Union was mired in a centrally planned, top-down technological bog. Their attempts to clone the IBM 360 mainframe computer in the 1970s had resulted in the Riot series, a buggy, unreliable, and already obsolete copy. They were a full decade, perhaps more, behind the West in microprocessor technology. They could not produce high-speed microchips in quantity. They could not write complex, iterative software. Their entire command structure was based on analog radio and teletype machines, while the Americans were passing digital data packets at the speed of light. The Soviet marshals, for all their talk of deep battle and operational art, were analog warriors in a digital world. They had built the world's largest, heaviest, and most expensive analog computer. And the highway of death was the result of it being plugged into a digital network. It was an abacus competing with a supercomputer. The final report that landed on Marshal Yazov's desk in the summer of 1991 was not just a military autopsy. It was a death warrant for the entire Soviet experiment. It was the killer statistic that finally proved beyond any shadow of a doubt that a system that stifles innovation, that fears decentralization, and that prizes imitation over invention cannot compete. The vast sums of money, a quarter of their entire gross domestic product, had been spent on a lie. They had built an army of ghosts, an army that looked terrifying on parade in Red Square, but that was technologically hollow. The highway of death was the mystery that solved itself. It was the epilogue of the Cold War, written in fire and steel. The great shock that the Soviets had spent their existence dreading the first strike from the West had finally come. But it was not a swarm of B-52 bombers or a wave of Minuteman missiles. It was a signal. It was a quiet, digital pulse, beamed from a constellation of satellites. A pulse that said, "You are here. The enemy is there. And you are too late." The mystery of the highway of death was the realization that the Cold War was not a contest of tanks or missiles or ideology. It was a contest of information. And the Soviet Union, a closed society built on secrets, paranoia, and the suppression of data, was destined to lose. The Iron Curtain did not fall because of a speech or a protest. It was rendered irrelevant by a network. It was made transparent, obsolete, and then, like a ghost on a radar screen, it was simply deleted.
And that was the Cold War. Back in a minute. Thank you. This is Ron, your host, the only true conservative in the United States today, bidding adios to all the butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers out there, and reminding you that you're not neutral and that the government has no rights.